Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Aquarium of the Pacific's Aquatic Academy. I'm Jerry Schubel, president of the Aquarium, and it's good to have all of you here with us this evening. Most of you know the aquarium is closed, and we're doing everything we can to safeguard our staff's health and their well-being, and also the health of our visitors. So we hope that all of you are taking good care and you're following the precautions recommended by the state and by your local government. All of those are based not only on the advice of state and local health departments, but also on the advice of the World Health Organization and the Centers for Disease Control. I want to illustrate something very important, I think, that I read this morning in an article by Dr. Gernot Wagner. He's an economist with NYU, the New York University. Formerly, he was at Harvard, and those of you who follow programs here at the Aquarium, you may remember him. He spoke in one of our aquatic forums. Didn't work. Okay. All right. So, if you look at this slide, and this, I think, says in very clear, compelling ways why it's important to flatten the curve. This is a compound growth curve, like compound interest. And right now, the coronavirus infections have increased in most European countries by 33% per day, and it's about the same in the US. It's a little less, but that's probably because we haven't been doing much in the way of testing. If we can flatten the growth curve from 33% per day to 3.3% per day, as Hong Kong and Singapore have done, then 100 cases today don't quite double in 3 weeks. But at the present rate of 33% per day growth, 100 cases today over a 3-week period will become 30,000 cases. Now, that doesn't mean that all these people are going to get desperately sick. It just means that they will be infected, and most of them will not be serious. But it's very clear that we need to flatten the curve, and the best evidence suggests that the way to do that is through physical, social separation, staying at home, keeping a distance of six feet from other people, avoiding crowds, and so on. And that's what we're doing here at the Aquarium, and most cities and states around the nation are doing that. So, the Aquarium has a lot of content. It's content that's appropriate for age groups all the way from pre-K to gray, and we're beginning to bundle that for different age groups, and we're going to launch Aquarium Live, which will be the Aquarium's online academy, by next Monday. We want to make all of these programs available online so that as many of the kids who are not in school and parents who are at home taking care of them are going to be able to benefit from these new programs and the ones that we've done in the past. And we will keep adding to that list of programs. Tonight, this is the third class in the Spring 2020 Aquatic Academy. Remember, the theme for this course is the effects of Earth's health on human health. And we welcome all of you, and we want to have a special welcome to our speaker, Dr. William Bill Ball, for agreeing to deliver this presentation tonight from his home in Maryland. Our other speaker, Alan Barreca, was unable to join us, but we'll get him back at a future date. Bill Ball is a professor emeritus of Johns Hopkins University, and in January, after 5 years, he retired as the director of the Chesapeake Research Consortium. He received his BS from the University of Virginia and MS and PhD degrees from Stanford University in environmental engineering. The Chesapeake Research Consortium, the CRC, brings together 7 leading universities within the Chesapeake Bay region. Johns Hopkins University, the University of Maryland, the Virginia Institute of Marine Sciences, that's William and Mary, Virginia Tech, Old Dominion University, and Penn State University, along with the Smithsonian Institution. And all of those institutions have programs that focus on the Chesapeake Bay, and the CRC was established to bring those programs together and give a greater focus. In our two previous classes, we talked about global issues. Tonight, we're going to talk about a regional issue, a very important region, the Chesapeake Bay region, the largest estuary in the United States, one of the largest in the world, the largest watershed of any estuary in the United States, and probably in the world. It's a region where I started my research career, and it's an estuary that I love and I continue to track. So please join me in welcoming Bill Ball. You can have a real clap in your living room or a virtual clap, but let's give him an enthusiastic welcome. Bill, thanks for being here.
Okay, thank you, Jerry. I very much appreciate the introduction. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be meeting with you all virtually this evening, and I thank you for attending. I hope that this finds you safe at home and able to get by without interacting too closely with anyone other than your housemates. And it seems to me that webinar tools such as this have come into their own just in time. And we hopefully can be part of a collective new approach that will allow us to survive through times like this, both psychologically, financially, and otherwise. And importantly, it may also finally drive society. I think this is a little bit of a soapbox, I guess, but to drive society away from the crazy idea of traveling thousands of miles, always just to meet at conferences. I remember having a laugh when the Sustainability Conference met in New Zealand. And those kinds of things I think this is going to be a new age. At the same time, it is awfully nice to meet people in person, and I very much missed this opportunity that I would have had to have dinner with my good friend Jerry Schubel and his colleagues, and to get to know some of you all better personally. But most importantly, I'll admit, I was looking forward to meeting up with my son and his family, who actually live out there in Orange County. So I was very much looking forward to this particular travel, and I'm very sorry not to be there personally. But with that said, let me very briefly introduce myself. As Jerry mentioned, I'm at Johns Hopkins University, where I'm an emeritus professor, and I just retired from the Chesapeake Research Consortium. My training and expertise is in physical and chemical processes of water quality, and for the last 5 years, I've had the honor and privilege of serving for the consortium. Before I begin, I really want to be sure to acknowledge many of my colleagues at the Chesapeake Bay Program Partnership. You'll be learning more about that over the course of this presentation. It's a group of 6 states, the city of Washington, D.C., and 22 different federal agencies, as well as all of the academic institutions that partner with them and numerous NGOs. And I'm going to try, but may not always succeed at acknowledging where the various slides came from, but many people contributed to this talk by sending me slides and otherwise helping me. So I'm going to begin with the title, Chesapeake Bay Blues, Greens, and Goofs, Protecting Water Quality in the Face of Climate Change. And I want to explain that a little bit. When I think of the Chesapeake Bay, I think of greens and blues. Blues include blue crabs, blue herons. Let me see if I can get my cursor. Yeah, there it is, the blue crabs and the blue herons. You can obviously see the blue in the crab. The greens include green grasses, both in marshes and on sea bottoms, as well as green turtles, and sometimes as well green and even blue-green algae, which you see down in the bottom right-hand corner there. More on that later. That particular shot is from the York River in Virginia from one of their aerial surveys. So in addition to lots of beautiful water in which to recreate, the Chesapeake Bay has also been hindered by some major goofs. There's been pollution over the years, a little overfishing. Down on the left there, you see the Menhaden industry, which have some motherships and lots of other little ships, and they actually literally, they pull those nets together and then suck the fish up and put them into the mothership. All those fish are turned into fertilizer, go into a lot of products that you have in your house, etc. It's been a long-standing industry. The little town, Tylertown, that where it was first formed, was actually the richest town in the United States back in the day in the 1800s. and it's been in existence ever since. It's been more or less sustainable, but lately they've been exceeding that, and that's been a problem. They've been exceeding their limits, and they've been pushed pretty hard. We all know about pollution. 1972 Clean Water Act helped clean a lot of that up from the wastewater treatment plants, but that it's been much harder to handle the non-point source runoff. You see up in the top right some farms, what happens when they get inundated, and it goes in the ditches and tile drains, ends up in the bay, bringing a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus. And down there at the bottom middle, you can see a large, a centralized animal feeding operation, a lot of chickens on the eastern shore of Virginia. And that's fertilizer that's particularly high in phosphorus and not so high in nitrogen. So if you put it on your crops, you end up with an excess of the phosphorus. And that's been a problem. And of course, on the right, you see the fish kills that unfortunately have been happening over the years. So there's also been some global scale goofs. I mean, the reason we're here talking about climate change is the use of coal and fossil fuels. You can see some dating way back. It actually goes back into the 1800s and before in England and otherwise the coal industry. And it's still going on today. The top is from about the 1930s or 40s. And then the middle slide is modern strip mining of coal. And down at the bottom, of course, very familiar to you out in California are the oil rigs, both offshore and all over the land. And then in the middle there, we see some of the means by which this coal is turned to carbon dioxide and pollutants and nitrogen. So these are the power plants there and the traffic jam with all those combustion engines running continuously while they're sitting there in traffic, burning that fuel that has caused the problems that we're dealing with today. That fuel is, as I was saying, it produces not only carbon dioxide and water, but it also produces some pollutants and nitrous oxide. Fortunately, and it's been a big help for the Bay, the air pollution standards have helped clean up a lot of that. But it's still an issue, and the carbon dioxide, of course, is the source of climate change. So that brings me to this next slide. Just to remind you, I think you're all pretty familiar with these curves. The top curve is carbon dioxide over the last 1,200 years. And the bottom curve is temperature over that same time, well, almost the same time period from 1,000 to 2,000. They're sort of lined up there. And you can see clearly that the carbon dioxide has been rising. The data in orange there at the top right of the figure, the top figure are data from Mauna Loa, and that's been going on since 1957. If anyone has questions, I have an extra slide in the back that I can talk further about that, but those are absolutely data over there on the right about the carbon dioxide. The data in the middle that's reasonably flat, but rising slightly toward the end. There is some natural oscillation in there that you see. The blue line is from the ice cores. The white, black, and gray are actually from some pine needles in Washington State. And that particular curve is one that the climate deniers were really loving to use for a long time because of the black excursions up there near where we are now. But you can see that now we're even pushing beyond that and making it very clear that the pine needle, the variability in the pine needle data was sufficient that the ice cores are probably more accurate, and they're pushing us right on target, and it's following right along with the CO2. So I hope that none of you out there are climate deniers. If you are, please stop. We're well beyond that. 97% of the world experts really recognize this is an issue, and we've just got to deal with it. So when I think about blues, greens, and goofs, there's another way to think about it as well. When I first came up with the title, I was thinking of this book, Chesapeake Bay Blues by Howard Ernst, 2003. And it was originally about science and politics, but really most of it's about politics and money and advocacy. And how do we get to where we need to go? Because it was written in 2003 when the Chesapeake Bay program I'm talking about was in full bloom, doing well. Getting a lot of work done, but not meeting the goals. It was an alliance of states, and the states weren't living up to their promises, and they actually had to be sued around 2000 by the Chesapeake Bay Foundation and others. And since 2010, after this book, really starting in 2002, but it put in force in 2010, we've been under the Clean Water Act, actually putting total maximum daily load provisions on the bay, and much more progress has been made. So Howard Ernst was right in some of the things he recommended, but the changes were actually already underway when he wrote the book, and we've moved forward. And that's in large thanks to the Greens. So another way of thinking about Greens are the people who contributed to the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, the people who got out there and took samples, did work. Shown in the bottom left is a fellow by the name of, in the hat, is Bernie Fowler, a fellow who on the Patuxent River, and he's still doing it today. I'm sure Jerry remembers when he did it when Jerry was here. He would walk out into the Patuxent River to see if he could see his tennis shoes and how deep he could wade until he could stop seeing his tennis shoes. And there's Bernie Fowler Day every year where he does that. He was a big influence on getting a lot of people interested in water clarity and those issues. And then in the bottom right, you'll see that photo again later. That's the actually the second signing of the Watershed Agreement that led to the partnership. And so finally, the other Goofs. I talked about Goofs in terms of things we did, but there's also Goofs in terms of the people. I found this very amusing. I hadn't looked at Mad Magazine since I was maybe 10 years old, 50 or 60 years ago. And it's interesting to see how relevant it all still is. America on the brink of ruin. Let him finish the job. At least he's honest about his idiocy. I mean, Alfred E. Newman just reminds me of too many politicians these days. But that's going to be my only political comment for the day. I'll come back to it at the end, however, because I do think this is one of the most important things we can do is get out there and advocate for the things we care about. Okay, so the outline of the real talk here. Excuse me, I'm just checking something. Is first, I want to give you an overview of the bay. I want to introduce you to this bay I love so much. I grew up on the bay. I grew up down there near the mouth, and I've been sailing on it every year of my life in one way or another. Even when I was out on the West Coast, I would come back and sail with my brother up and down the bay, and I've come to really love it. I always loved it. It's why I got into this profession. It's a complex, large ecosystem, and now it's troubled with climate change. And so we'll be talking a little bit about that. When I was thinking about the title of this talk, I have to admit I struggled because I don't usually deal directly with human health. I have a lot of colleagues at the Johns Hopkins University, of course, who do, both in the School of Medicine and in the School of Public Health, and of course the hospital. But the School of Public Health is one of the best in the nation, and they deal with this all the time. You've probably seen them in the news over the coronavirus. But myself, I'm an engineer. I've worked with engineered treatment of water and also water movement and pollutants in the environment. And so I think more about ecosystems. But the two are inextricably linked. And you'll see some direct ways in which things happening in the bay have absolutely direct effects on human health and our ability to deal with climate change. And you'll also see some really important indirect ways. And just generally, I have a movie to recommend to you, which is The Biggest Little Farm, and it's all about diversity and the need to keep our ecosystems functioning so that we can keep things like this coronavirus in check. It helps when there are other bacteria out there actually to help keep these things moving. We can't control everything. But that's, again, not my expertise, so I'm going to not focus on that, but I do want to make the point that these things are inextricably linked and talk about how us working on the ecosystems can help with human health. Following that, I'll give a brief history and overview of Chesapeake Bay management. It's really not as brief as I would like it to be. I hope I can get through it quickly. There's an awful lot there. And then I want to get to really talking about some of the additional challenges brought on by climate change. So moving right along, this particular slide, it was kind of transparent on my title slide, if you were wondering what that was. It's an aerial photo that was taken by an astronaut, Andrew Morgan, who was on the International Space Station. He's actually from Maryland, and I think he really enjoyed it. And actually from UMSI, is one of our institutions, or the University of Maryland. And he enjoyed, I think, this really open view of the Chesapeake. And so here up in the top right, you can see Lower Bay of New York. That's actually that little hook at the bottom is Sandy Hook, actually. But where the arrow is pointing is the Upper Bay. and leading up into the East River, and then the arrows pointing to Manhattan. Delaware Bay is the other fat bay there, and then the Chesapeake, which is about 300 kilometers long, about 180 miles long, and the long river up at its mouth is the Susquehanna. And then you can see the Potomac curling around in the middle, and right up there where the wide part of that water ends is Washington, D.C. And then it's not too far on land from Baltimore, which is where I've lived for many years, but it's quite a bit of ways by water, as you can see. So it's an interesting photo, gives you a little perspective. Stepping back and looking at it in map terms, actually the third and fourth slides here are also satellite photos with some doctoring to get rid of clouds and merge things and so forth. But let's just walk through this. Shown on the left is the eastern U.S. What's shown in white there is actually the modeling domain for the air quality model that feeds the Chesapeake Bay. We'll talk a little bit about that later. That air quality modeling needs to take into account the weather patterns that are coming in from the boundary condition on the left and then the boundary conditions all around. And then that light blue area on the airshed is the area from which smokestacks or cars polluting can, depending on the weather, reach our watershed. So the nitrous oxides that come up from the automobiles are an important source of nitrogen. Historically, they've accounted for as much as 25%. They're down way now, but 25% of the entire nitrogen that came into the bay for a while was coming from automobiles that with the nitrous oxides that fell in the watershed. It's also acid rain because it's nitric acid, but more importantly is the nitrate itself. And at least for us, and the nitrate penetrates the ground, goes over land. It happens to be the kind of molecule, it's NO3 minus for those of you who are chemists, but it's a kind of molecule that doesn't attach to soils. It can sometimes be used by bacteria, but generally it moves with the groundwater pretty well, and it gets straight into the Chesapeake with time. And so the airshed is important for us to model. And then there's also in green there, shown on that map, and then again to the right, expanding out, you see the watershed. The watershed's outlined in white. Those little striped lakes at the top are the Finger Lakes of New York. Cornell University is at the bottom of one of those Finger Lakes. And it's interesting when you drive to Baltimore from Cornell, you're driving north to south and you're following a drop of water the whole way. So your car mileage is quite a bit different coming from Cornell to Baltimore than going the other way around. And it's really the first time I appreciated that, I was just awestruck that the watershed extended up that far. And then to the right, we see the bay itself. This particular photo was taken after some really hard rainstorms that hit the lower half of the bay, but not the north. Sometimes you see that brown there, the sediment in the water really reflects light, so it actually looks worse than it is, to be honest with you, but it's pretty bad. There's lots of suspended sediments in that water, and you can really see them coming in. And so satellites are really good at picking up those sediments, and they're quite strong. They would look brown even from the ground, but not that brown. And under other storms, like under Hurricane Agnes and other storms, you'll see the top of the bay, the Susquehanna River, that long Susquehanna River, looking just like that. But in this particular day, there were some rainstorms in the lower bay and not further up north. So moving on then, let me get some other facts up here about the watershed in the bay. As Jerry said, it's a very large watershed, 64,000 square miles. It's got a very large land to water area ratio because it's got a big watershed for a reasonably small bay. The depth of the bay is only about 21 feet, about 6 meters, and it's 50 to really more like 140 feet at its very maximum in the deep main channel with broad shoals. We'll look at the bathymetry a little bit later. This next statistic, this drainage area to water volume, 168,000 square kilometers of drainage area, as you see above the 64,000 square miles, and 68 cubic kilometers of water. Okay, that number doesn't mean much to many of us. It's a ratio, But it's interesting to think about because it's the largest of any coastal water body in the entire world by a lot. It's like 5 times the next one, which is Bay in Finland. So it's really shallow with a big watershed, and that's the reason it's been so productive over the years. It teemed with oysters when John Smith first arrived, and the Native Americans just, really lived off it. It was the Bay of Plenty, the land of sky blue waters, and it's because of all those nutrients. They are nutrients for lower organisms like phytoplankton and zooplankton, and then the fish eat those, and the bigger fish eat the little fish, and so on. And so it's been a very productive bay. So in terms of fisheries, it's been very productive. Problem is, we're now, since World War II and the Haber-Bosch process for bringing nitrogen out of the atmosphere, we are overdoing it with regard to these nutrients. And we'll get to that later. But there's 25 major tributaries, lots of minor ones. The coastline is another feature of the Chesapeake, which makes it a lot of people's favorite estuary. It's just so beautiful to boat on because you can go up and down these different tributaries. So the thinking more of the watershed and the people on it, it is a human natural complex. I already talked about this drainage area to water volume, but I didn't talk about the population. There's 18 million now on the bay, growing every year, about 150,000 new residents a year. Right now, that's a lot of people. That's a small town every year. Again, I talked about the tributaries. It's useful to think about the way the land is the land use on the bay. The Bay program thinks about that a lot, as you might imagine. The things that have been changing is the developed land. Actually, the forested has been going up a little bit lately. Agriculture has been going down a little bit, but developed has been changing a lot. And that's been eating into both the forested and the agriculture. So that's, but it's right now it's about 5 to 10% growing though. I think this slide may be a little dated in that regard. It's probably over 10% now. Farms, interestingly enough, and there are a lot of them, especially up in New York, well, all through the whole watershed, but Pennsylvania and New York have a lot of farms, a lot of Amish up there, and a lot of small farms. So other than the animal feed operations, which are unfortunately getting increasingly centralized and problematic, the regular farms, the row crops and so forth are typically in small farms, which makes it difficult in some ways to manage because you have lots of people to work with. And of course, with a watershed this size and all that natural land, you've got a lot of species of plants, fish, and other large animals. So we can think about it by jurisdiction. As I said, there's 6 states involved. We've got all the way up into New York, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, DC, Delaware, a little piece of Delaware there. That the peninsula over on the right is called the Delmarva Peninsula, and the darker green drains to the bay, and the lighter green drains out to the ocean. And I'll be talking about it. We call it the Eastern Shore because it's the eastern shore of the Chesapeake Bay, and then we also talk about the Western Shore. But that tells you a little bit about the politics, if you will. We can also look at it in terms of the tributaries. So I won't get into that too much here. We'll talk a little bit about them later. The Susquehanna River is, of course, the largest. It's responsible for about 50% or more of the flow to the Chesapeake. Of course, it depends on where the rain is falling on any particular day, but generally it's averages a little over 50%, and more than that of the nutrients. But about 50% of the flow comes from the Susquehanna River. The Chesapeake is, in fact, the drowned river valley of the Susquehanna. We'll look at that a little later, too. And so these underlying rivers, the James, the Appomattox, the Potomac, the Susquehanna, the Patuxent, the Choptank, the Pamunkey, and the Mattaponi, those are 9 rivers, I think they're 9 if we count them, that are part of what the United States Geological Survey, the USGS, calls the River Input Monitoring Program. So they're gauged, and they also take samples of water quality at the fall line. And we'll talk a minute about the fall line. So shown here are the watersheds going all the way into the tidal fresh estuaries and the tidal estuaries. So we actually call our creeks and rivers in the Chesapeake, you can be talking about a creek and river and actually sail up into it because it's tidal up to a certain point. In fact, Washington, D.C. has a tidal fresh estuary. It's fresh water up there, but it's tidal, and there's a tidal basin by the Jefferson Memorial. So that's just an important aspect. And all the lower parts of these rivers, in the white shown in this diagram, the lower parts of the rivers are all draining into the tidal portion of the estuary. And the groundwater goes also either into the bay, or some of the groundwater, if it goes deep enough, that's typically the groundwater from the mountains rather than the groundwater in those regions. But if some of the groundwater goes to deep aquifers and doesn't see daylight, but it sees ocean on the other side of the Chesapeake. But in that region, most of the groundwater will probably make it into the bay. So there's groundwater, surface water getting into the bay, and then those colored regions are above the fall line, and you can see the fall line shown there in black. And those colored regions are the actual watersheds for all those different little tributaries. And you can see that the Mattaponi and the Pamunkey, which are the pink and the yellow, they drain into the York River. The York River itself has no watershed that's above the fall line, except for what its two feeding tributaries. But anyway, the most important thing here really is to look at the Susquehanna and to see how large that watershed area is. And so Pennsylvania, which unfortunately doesn't have coast on the bay, is the biggest polluter. And so that has made the Chesapeake Bay a very interesting case study for the EPA, because they are trying to help regulate with the states, in cooperation with the states, which is a good thing, a watershed where the person upstream is not necessarily the same people. The people upstream are not necessarily the same people who are benefiting from all the seafood industry and so forth. But I had a real eye-opening moment when I heard about an Amish farmer who wasn't doing a whole lot to keep his cows out of the creek until he was told that there were oyster fishermen downstream whose livelihood was being affected. And that's something he could really appreciate as a working person who cared about the land. And so that recognition is really an important part of what brings the watershed together. But there are, of course, disputes. Pennsylvania is lagging behind, as you might expect, the other states. It's lagging behind the other states in its cleanup, and that's a controversy right now. But it's trying hard, and the Bay program appreciates every effort. Just in the upper left, we won't talk at all about that, but those are just the geologic regions associated with, and so that's important too, obviously, for things like groundwater. And so this is a very well-studied region, very well understood what's going on here, but we still have lots and lots of questions. So now turning to the bay itself, shown on the left is a figure that Larry Sanford at UMCE's provided with me, and on the right is one provided by Rich Batuk. I'm not sure either one of them were the authors of those figures, and unfortunately we've lost the provenance, so I can't give due credit where it's due. But the figure on the left is really one of my favorites. It's a nice one. It shows the bathymetry in kind of a very graphic way. You can see that deep channel running down the middle. That is the former bed of the Susquehanna River, and you can see how shallow it is on the sides. The little note there in the middle, about 300 kilometers being 185 miles, and then you can do some calculations. If the bay is 100 feet deep and 185 miles long, it's about a 1 in 1,000 ratio between depth and length. So if you were to actually well, I'll come to this in a moment when I start showing profiles, but we always exaggerate the scale on the vertical. But if you didn't exaggerate the scale, the whole thing could be fit on a piece of paper. So its thickness is no thicker than a piece of paper, even at its deepest point. A piece of paper as long as the bay. It would be, well, 11-inch piece of paper would be the thickness of a paper. So if you shrunk the whole thing down and fit it onto paper. Anyway, I had a hard time explaining that concept to a few people. I'm struggling again now. But on the right is a graphic of the depth, and you can see how we use colors to indicate things. And you'll see a lot of these kinds of graphics. The blue is indicating the depth, the deeper regions, and the red, the shallows in this particular graph. So that's how the bay is laid out, and that's why the average depth is only 21 feet, even though it has places that are 100 feet deep. You can compare that to the Great Lakes, where the entire lake is 400, 800 feet deep. So it's quite a different type of thing, and the Mediterranean is also quite deep. So I talked about that piece of paper and the profile. So here we have the depth on the left axis and the distance on the right axis. The distance is in kilometers, the depth is in meters. And so that's where, if we were to do this to scale, the whole thing would fit into almost the line at the very top of the graph, or at the bottom of the graph. The actual depth would fit within that line. So that's the scale is a huge exaggeration. If we exaggerated it less or stretched it out more, all those sharp peaks and valleys would look like they really are, which is not so sharp and steep at all. But this shows where the deep spots are and so forth. Also shown here, based on some cores of the square symbols and the round symbols and so forth, are different deep cores that have been taken over the years. And they showed where the original bottom was of the old Susquehanna Channel. And so you can see the original channel, and you can also see how infilling over thousands of years, many thousands of years, has led to the current bathymetry and profile. And so this graph, I would like you to get used to looking at it. We have north on the left, south on the right, or this kind of graph. And the head of the bay is near the Susquehanna, and the mouth of the bay, where the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel is on the right. The head's on the left, mouth is on the right, draining from left to right. Water at the top of the bay flows net from left to right, and something that may be a surprise to some of you is the water net, after, average after tides. Net flow on the bottom is from right to left, up until, and that's the saline water coming in underneath the fresh water driving out on top. And so that salinity gradient is one of the things that's a primary driver of stratification in the Chesapeake Bay. Temperature is another driver, but in the bay, unlike lakes, it's primarily the salinity rather than the temperature that causes the bottom to not mix so well with the top. And we'll come back to that later. Okay, so that brings me to this idea of ecosystems and human health and trying to talk about that. Well, let me just begin by talking about the ecosystem health and bay water quality and the things that impact it. We've talked about nitrogen and phosphorus. Ever since it was called, ironically in a way, the Green Revolution. It was a great thing for humankind that we're able to extract nitrogen from the atmosphere and make fertilizers. We've been able to grow a lot more food because of that. However, if we put more nitrogen and phosphorus on the ground than the plants take up, and more than we remove when we remove the plants, and more than we can recover from wastewater treatment plants, so we'd have to recover that nitrogen and phosphorus. If we don't, where does it end up? A lot of it ends up in our waterways and our coasts, and that's why coasts all over the world are suffering this problem, coasts and lakes and rivers. And so the excess nitrogen and phosphorus runoff, when you hear about nutrient pollution, these things aren't really pollutants, right? They're nutrients. They're things that grow phytoplankton in animals, but in excess, they are indeed a pollutant. And the excess algal growth leads to, well, the nitrogen and phosphorus lead to excess algal growth. Algae, as you may know, are plants. They're phytoplankton. And so they get, they're autotrophs, as it's called, which means they get their carbon automatically, they do it themselves. They get their carbon from the atmosphere. So they take up the carbon as CO2 from the atmosphere in the daytime. They emit CO2 at night, so that's kind of a wash, less than a wash, actually. But they take up the CO2, and that's where they get their carbon. So they're not limited by carbon. And nitrogen, phosphorus, and nutrients are what limit them. They grow in excess. They settle, consumed by bacteria. And the bay is stratified in the summer, as I talked about, by temperature, but it's always stratified a little bit by salinity. We also have better winds in the winter that mix that up, and better flows in the spring that mix that up. But in the summer, the stratification gets really severe. The temperature reinforces it, and it gets quite severe. Like, it's also true in lake, but the deep water is isolated from the surface is the point. So it's a real problem, because during the day, when the algae are actually making oxygen and taking out CO2, a lot of the oxygen they make is discharged to the atmosphere because they're floating on the surface, and the water can't hold that much oxygen, so it just disappears. And then at night, they take up oxygen from the water, and so they're actually a net loss there of oxygen through the algae. And then it gets really bad, as I said before, when they sink and the bacteria eat them up and use that oxygen. So the result is that these harmful algal blooms lower the DO of the water and remove habitats for fish. And also, as is mentioned below, the harmful algal blooms, HABs as they're called, can be toxic in their own right, because these algae emit toxins, some of them. Not always, not all algae, and in fact, the majority, and certainly the majority in Chesapeake, do not. But as you know better than we on the East Coast, on the West Coast, you have these quite a bit, the red tides and so forth, where certain kinds of algae can emit toxins. And we have some of that in the Chesapeake, but the toxins are mostly for the fish. Human problems are not too severe. We do have Vibrio vulnificus now, which is a bacteria. And so we do have some skin diseases and things like that that are starting to show up and are climate related. So it's an issue. Okay, just to talk a little bit more about this, I'm not going to get into this whole nitrogen cycling. This slide is from Jeremy Testa, a good colleague at UMC's Chesapeake Biological Laboratory. He's thinking about the cycling, and over on the left, he has what he calls normal conditions, normal oxygen content, a well-mixed system with good oxygen. On the right are what we call hypoxic, too little oxygen on the right. And the too little oxygen, my little arrow, my black arrow in text describes the main thing going on here, which is what I just described, the algae sinking and removing the oxygen. But on top of that, we've got the cycling. So the point is that you can actually see this. You can see that these are little microcosms that he brought up from the bottom, or mesocosms, if you will. He uses them for looking at flux, but he seals them off at the top and looks at those. And I'm going to need to speed up a little bit here. So I'm going to start moving through these slides a little bit more quickly. I want to show the temporal history of oxygen. It's maximum, and the depletion is maximum in midsummer. So these are various sampling points, the white dots, the Chesapeake Bay program. This was begun by the Chesapeake Bay Institute, which was an organization Jerry worked for back in the day. The sampling was begun by the Chesapeake Bay Institute, Don Pritchard and others there. Jerry was associate director. Don Pritchard was his director at the time. They started the sampling of the bay for salinity and temperature primarily, and since then the Chesapeake Bay program has been sampling regularly for all kinds of things. And so they can plot dissolved oxygen. And this is again a view. This is not a view of distance now on the X scale. This is time. And so you can see if we look at the bottom oxygen versus the top oxygen. Well, it's actually shown at the top is saturation, so it's what the top would be if it's in equilibrium with the atmosphere, which it often is close to. So saturation's up there, and you can see at the bottom is pretty well saturated in the, and it's shown in micromolars, so forgive me for that. I'll give that, the 62 micromolars is about 2 milligrams per liter. And so below 2 milligrams per liter, we call hypoxia. It's too little oxygen for micromoles. Below 62 micromoles, or 2 milligrams per liter, is too little for a fish to live. So a fish could not live down there at the bottom in the hypoxic zone, and that's sometimes called the dead zone. And you can see that dead zone exists between June and September, and otherwise the bottom waters are reasonably well aerated. And so Jeremy is looking particularly at the depletion rate in time, and he's also looking at how the onset of hypoxia may switch with conditions and so forth. We had a project together where he was looking at that. But, oops, I don't know what's happening here. Forgive me. Okay. So here is a graph made by my own doctoral student where she was trying to look at different ways of interpolating measured data. And that's not the point of this slide. The point of this slide is to show two types of models, and this interpolation, where you simply take the data points and kind of connect the dots, if you will. In this case, the dots are those circles. Those are the Bay program measurements from this ship. So those are done over the course of about a week or two, where the ship moves with the tides, tries to collect vertical sampling data as best it can that represent a snapshot in time, more or less. And the colors inside the circles are in some cases different than the colors outside the circles, and that's where the model didn't match the data. But if the model matches the data, then the circles are the same color as the model. It's kind of a nice way to look at things. And you see two models. At the top, you see our connecting the dots model, where we're just using the data to kind of draw a pretty picture. The technique is called kriging, and we have less error than we do at the bottom, but the bottom is completely simulated from nitrogen inputs and wind and temperature, phytoplankton growth rates, water conditions that come from the rivers, the whole 9 yards. That's all done with a computer model. And it's pretty darn close. If you look at considering what I just said. So if you look at the orange and the yellow, well, the orange and the red, sorry, not the yellow. The orange and the red together comprise hypoxic water. And the model does pretty well on that in terms of capturing most of the data, and it gets the spots where the hypoxia is happening. I want you to appreciate that, because we're going to be using modeling results later. and just realize that they're not perfect, but they get the gist. And these models have been developed over 40 years, and they've been fine-tuned, and they seem to do a reasonably good job for what they're intended to do. They won't get things in certain places, like shallow waters places and up in the tributaries. They're still working on improving those models. But for the main bay, it works well. And so now we're moving, oops, I didn't realize this one was animated. I apologize. So now we move to modeling the response of dissolved oxygen to nitrogen. And so this is these are model data. So it's important that you have some trust in the model, which all the Bay partners fortunately do now. That's been something the Bay program has really worked on. We get collaborative modeling and try to make sure everybody's happy. It's been a course of lawsuits. We won't get into that, but it's a pretty good model. So what we see here is that nitrogen under the actual conditions is shown in the middle right now. This is with the current situation in terms of land use, et cetera. The Bay program can also model changes in land use and changes in the situation. But that's a typical June hypoxic volume in those deep waters. And then you can see that if you cut the nitrogen by 20 down to a quarter of that, you get less. And if you go up to twice that, you get more. So it's not surprising, but it's nice to see and to actually quantify what the amounts are. So nitrogen in this region of the bay is the limiting nutrient, as we say. There's plenty of phosphorus, and so nitrogen is limiting at this time of year and in this place. In the bay, both nutrients matter at different times and places. So what are the requirements for an algal bloom? Light, often present, can't do anything about that. And then these nutrients. And then it also depends on predation, which zooplankton are around to eat them, et cetera. And that really matters. But again, the nitrogen and phosphorus are the issues. So what are the problems with these algal blooms? In addition to the dead zone creation, which I've already talked about, they also block light, hinder growth of the SAV, as we call it, which is seagrass. The algae, in addition to blocking light from just floating mats on the surface and just turbidity which is a big problem, the turbidity in the water, if it keeps the light from getting down, but also the algae actually attach to the plant leaves and can, really reduce the plant's ability. And there's harms to aquatic life. There are a lot of toxins that these algae produce under certain conditions. We'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. You guys know them very, very well out there on the West Coast, more than we do. You get your red tides and things like that. And there's also a current problem with I'll get into that a little bit later, of cyanobacter from freshwater, where they produce the toxins in the freshwater, and then the toxins actually make it out into the sea and create some problems. And the same thing happens in the bay. We have to watch the freshwater systems. They can also impact marine organisms by clogging fish gills, abrading tissues, and other things. For example, there's some algae that are parasites for crabs. And you've heard about, seafood poisoning, on certain red tides and so forth. You can't eat the seafood. There are neurotoxins, there are hepatotoxins, liver toxins. Dermal exposures are bad. They can in a lot of cases where they can keep things from healing. So these algal blooms have pretty bad side effects. I'm not going to dwell on this slide at all, but there's a website at the bottom. And if this slideshow is available to you later, you can go to that website. It's put out by the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. And you can see a lot of from there, they have a lot of good information about HABs. And so there are these are the species commonly found in Chesapeake Bay. When you look at the health effects, you'll know that fortunately, we don't have the really major problems that happen either in some freshwater systems or in some of the more saline systems. But so the brackishness helps us. The one species we have, the Alexandrium there, even the particular species that we have is not the most problematic one. But they are obviously a nuisance and they're a problem. Oops, I think I'm going backwards. Okay. This is the second slide. I have one for the U.S. coastlines. Oh, these are I'm sorry. These are the Chesapeake. If you like micrographs, these are pictures of them. The only one I haven't talked about, or that wasn't on that graph, it wasn't on the VIMS graph, was cyanobacter in the bottom right. That's because that's a freshwater species, also previously called blue-green algae. And the fact that it's fresh, the top of the bay is fresh, so we're not immune to this bacterium, and it does occur. Cyanobacter blooms do occur, and the Microcystis is one of the worst in some ways, and they produce microcystin, which is a hepotoxin. But fortunately, these blooms, they're bad in some places like the Baltic. They haven't been bad here yet. And then we can at that website, you can also learn more about some of these HAB blooms, these algal blooms that you hear about on the Gulf Coast and the West Coast and so forth, and the species involved and the shellfish poisoning. Okay, so those are kind of the issues. We think that's, obviously it's important, the ecosystem and the human health are clearly related. I want to go through a history of Chesapeake Bay management. I'm going to be flying through this. I hope you'll forgive me, but there's a lot of material here, and I need to move through it. So I can really break it down. And it's been 72 years that we've been doing research and work on the Bay. So there's a lot of good data, a lot of continuous data. The first 36 years was before the Bay program, the Chesapeake Bay Program Partnership, and the last 36 years is after the Chesapeake Bay Program Partnership. This Chesapeake Research Consortium I mentioned is formed in 1972, and it was in the middle of that first period. And so the scientists really developing a lot of the research is what led to the second period. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. CBI has been in existence for a long time. Those other organizations were in existence even longer. But we'll just start from 48 because that's when CBI started long-term monitoring of the Bay. Fundamental science, these are the scientific research. These are the three leaders of the organizations. The University of Maryland on the right is Eugene Cronin, Virginia Institute of Marine Science in the middle, and Don Pritchard, who Jerry knows so well, in the center. And then the first Watershed Agreement. So all that good research got everybody together. That and the Chesapeake Bay Foundation with Save the Bay bumper stickers and all the rest. We actually formed a partnership in 1983. 1987, it started taking on a lot more oomph. They started really doing much more cooperative agreements with the CRC and others. Meanwhile, the institutions had to continue to find their own major fundamental research money, but in terms of management, it was all being done, organized by EPA. So EPA is just the administrator of a partnership that has all the states and other federal agencies, USGS, NOAA, Fish and Wildlife, 22 agencies, federal agencies, in addition to the state agencies. And so there have been, over time, a total of 4 watershed agreements, as well as a total maximum daily load, TMDL effort, part of the Clean Water Act. I mentioned that earlier, the lawsuit around 2000. And so now we have to have watershed implementation plans to try to get the nutrient loadings down to a reasonable level. The little graph on the right there just shows which areas the loading matters the most. If you're worried about the deep channel. Of course, if you're worried about your own tributary, the area that matters the most is the land right next to it. So, and those two have their own TMDLs. So, but the EPA is enforcing the one for the Bay, and the states have to do the ones for their individual rivers. And the Bay program, under the advisement of a scientific technical advisory committee, continues to improve the way it works. It's now under an adaptive management approach, which is or adaptive. That should be adaptive. Adaptive. That should be an A. Management approach where they continue to change what they do as they go. Okay, so all these watershed agreements. I want to focus on the last and where we are with that. There are lots of challenges. We're going to focus on the ones related to the pollution and climate change. Those things actually relate. The climate change relates to all of these. It relates to stormwater, it relates to fishery disease, it relates to storms and increasing frequency of storms we're going to see in our region. We're also going to see increasing amounts of rainfall to some extent. So they're all connected. That 2014 agreement has lots of goals and outcomes. Without belaboring these, I want to point to the two that we've talked a lot about already and will continue to talk about. Water quality lies right between the watershed and the fisheries. And the hope is that by getting water quality under control, it'll force people to clean up their watersheds, and there will be co-benefits up in those watersheds with their tributaries. and the fisheries will also benefit. And there are a lot of people right now there's a lot of grief saying, oh, it's always about the water quality. The water quality goal implementation team gets all the resources and all the effort. What about us? And there's starting to be more and more emphasis put on these other goals, environmental literacy, stewardship, public access, the things that can help us get to the water quality. Just moving on, I want to talk a little bit about the regulatory approach so you understand where I'm coming from when I talk about the impacts of climate on that regulatory approach. A lot of the regulatory approach is aimed at nutrient and sediment pollution. And so there's through the models and other means of understanding where the loads are in the watershed, how much nitrogen's getting down, this air source you see here, that's the green arrow on the left, and the nitrogen, not the green wedge on the left. That's the atmospheric deposition I talked about before. At the time of this slide, which I think is around 2009, at the beginning of the TMDL process, it was 20%, the atmospheric deposition. You can see the purple is the non-point source runoff, and the green is municipal wastewater. We have made a lot of progress. I'd say we've more than cut that green wedge down to maybe about maybe a third or a fourth, and even a fifth of where it is now. And so the big remaining fruit is really in the purple at this point. And we've gotten a lot of benefit from that light green too. So thank you, California, for your air pollution control laws that have become national. Okay, so in terms of looking at the data, the Bay program has a whole method of taking observations, interpolating, connecting the dots within those interpolation schemes, combining those and averaging them and looking at them compared to a frequency diagram that allows you to exceed in a certain amount of time and a certain amount of space, et cetera, et cetera. And so they really look, they try to tell you how well you're doing. And this graph was showing that in 2009, not so well, because in one criterion or another, whether it's the deep water or the shallow water or the mid water, the bay was declared an impaired water body. And that's what led to the enforcement under the Clean Water Act. And so this is just showing the dissolved oxygen issue and why that's a problem. The striped bass need good oxygen, so they are now limited to the very top of the water. The oysters need at least 1 milligram per liter to survive, and crabs need 3. So when we have those hypoxic zones, not even the crabs can live at the bottom. And these different organisms set the criteria. And then we can look this map at where the most sensitive areas are for a given amount of pollution in terms of the harm it does. Now this map is, I want to emphasize, is just for the deep channel of the bay, and other regions would light up red if you're worried about the Potomac or the James or other places. Okay, so just moving on, these are the suite of computer models that make all this possible. There's an airshed, there's land change, there's a scenario builder where they can look at different scenarios, the watershed model, and then the actual bay model, which has hydrodynamics as well as water quality. And then they're moving out into doing future models with the oysters themselves and so forth and how they affect water quality. And these models are used to model the effects. Did you exceed that? That's the criteria assessment procedures. And then if you've got a problem, if you're exceeding, then they're going to try to allocate your loadings based on these models. These models have a lot of use. They're very, very important, which is why they have spent so much time on them. So just going through the results, how the bay is doing. Every year the bay comes out with this barometer and looks at how it's doing in a lot of different regards. Water quality, this is based on the model, based on best management practices that are up in the watershed. How are we doing? How do we think we're doing based on what we know is going into the watershed and what we know people have put in place? So this isn't measured data at all. It's just based on what the partners report of what they have done. And those things are, the Bay program does go out and ensure that in fact they did put up fencing to keep the cows out and stuff, but we don't know for a fact that those measures have had the effect we hope they would yet. But they're applying less fertilizer, they're doing the things they need to do, and they have goals in this regard. And even those goals, they're having a hard time meeting. They've met them for phosphorus and sediment, but not for nitrogen. They're still 15 million pounds short, even of the interim goal of 2017. By 2025, we're supposed to have all the watersheds in place that would, in principle, according to the model at steady state, get us to a clean bay, or at least a sustainable bay. However, there are already good signs that this work is paying off. Seagrasses are coming back. They've been coming back for 6 years now. There are 130,000 acres more than they were in 2012. And so these are really coming back. It's a great success story, a complicated one, but a great one. They were really hurt after Hurricane Agnes in 72, and they are finally coming back. They're coming back in a big way. So that's really good. It's leading to other things, we hope. Blue crabs, up and down, up and down. That's a fisheries management issue more than anything else. And they're very finicky creatures, but their larvae depend on the currents and the river flows and a lot of other things. And you think they have that more or less under control. It turns out crabs are actually going to be winners with climate change because they like the warm weather, and they do okay with the less salinity. Okay, and then there's tidal water quality. We're not going to talk about that. That's just the percent of standards achieved, and you could say whether it's increasing or not. They've actually stopped reporting it quite this way in recent times. Now we want to look at the river data. So here we're seeing nitrogen, phosphorus, and suspended sediments over time, and you can see the line there. The blue line is river flow. And so you can see this depends a lot on the hydrology, right? It depends a lot on how much rain there is. The more rain there is, the more you get the wash off of the nutrients, the more you push out groundwater that's got high residual concentrations of nitrate from history. And so you've got problems during the high flows. And it's very hard to measure progress this way. But the Bay does have another way of looking at progress with something called flow normalized nitrogen. And here we're looking at trends. Over the period 2019 to 2018, and you can't see them, but there are little arrows inside those blue and orange dots. The orange dots are places with really high pounds per acres. And over on the right, you can see which ones are gaining and which ones are losing. The orange are gaining and the green, they have reduced. So in net, it looks like we've done a pretty good job reducing the nitrogen. There's some places that have a lot more work to do, but the big inputs are being reduced. That's good. More work to do. Phosphorus, different story. So despite all those graphs about the model and so forth, it's not actually happening on the ground, and the phosphorus is running off, and that's probably a lot related to phosphorus to nitrogen ratios being too high, and other things with these animal feeds. The Potomac has their phosphorus under control. That's an interesting thing. They've actually been doing good reductions there. But anyway, so that's progress. So now let's get to the real heart of this. I'm sorry it's as late as it is, and I think that I probably am about out of time, but I don't want to not get through this, so let me just go. We are having sea level rise on the Chesapeake, a lot of it, more than most places because the land is subsiding at the same time as the sea is rising at almost the same rate. You may know that the glaciers depressed the northern part of the country. It was kind of like a teeter-totter, while the northern part of the country is rebounding and rising up a little bit. It's good for New York. But down here, we're on the other side of the teeter-totter, and the land is subsiding as we rebound from the glaciers, actually. So it's a double problem. But our sea level rise is estimated to be, on average, 22 centimeters. As it says up there in black at the top of the slide. So it's about 9 inches by 2025. It's already gone up 4 inches since 1970. And that foot that we're going to have above the 1970 levels, we're going to really feel it. Places are really flooding already. We'll get to that in a moment. Anyway, the Bay program with their model has looked at all of this. They've looked at the climate on the right. They've looked at the rainfall on the right. They looked at the fact that the temperature of the ocean is going to be a degree centigrade higher. That's already happened. That's that climate change issue, or it will have happened by 2025. And we're really almost there now, to be quite honest with you. And then the flow, we are expecting more rain over the Chesapeake watershed, especially in the winter, it turns out, which is actually not good if it's in the spring. It's okay if it's in the fall. But anyway, there's going to be more rainfall, and it's going to be more flashy, which is also an issue because you have more intense storms that wash off that phosphorus. But the extra loading from that of nitrogen, here we're just looking at nitrogen, and we're getting an extra 2.4% of nitrogen from the watershed. And then we've got the temperature of the water itself. That's what that sun means there. Looking at 31 global climate models and picking through them the best they can because they're not so accurate on a regional level. But the Bay program figures the air is going to increase about 1 degree centigrade between now and 2025. And so that's another degree. So we're going to get up to that 2 degree. And so there we are. Putting that all together, I'm not going to work through these. This shows that the loads of oxygen, so we actually get more oxygen coming in from the ocean. So the oxygen mass is actually helping us. The sea level rise actually brings in more oxygen. So that's going to be a good thing. But the bigger problem, and here's the oxygen, you can see, or here's all those different components. Sea level rise, you can see the light blue, that's a good thing. That means the oxygen is actually going to be going up. Due to sea level rise, but due to the flow, it's going to be kind of neutral. The flow's not impacting things too badly, except up in some of the tributaries. But the temperature itself is a big problem because those bacteria are chomping faster on the algae, and the algae are growing faster, et cetera. And also, importantly, oxygen doesn't dissolve in water as well at warm temperatures. So all those factors together, you get that rightmost figure. And if we put it all together, which is where I want to go, we get here, which is all factors together. We're going to have 12% more hypoxic volume in the summer because of climate change. And that means that there's going to be about 6 million more pounds of nitrogen that has to be removed. And that's going to cost people a lot of money. It's causing a lot of headache. And that's going to slow down the whole process. And unless they can keep up with it, there's going to be worse algal blooms. And then beyond that, there's another category of climate-related loads that's not yet accounted, and that's just due to sea level rise pretty damn directly. And it's Margie Mulholland, a colleague down in Norfolk at Old Dominion University, looked at what she calls blue sky flooding. So this is in Norfolk, Virginia, where my family is from, actually, and they're trying to adapt to this. The water at high tide comes onto the land, and at low tide it recedes. And so that receding water has oil from gas stations. It has nutrients from the land. It has tire dust with all kinds of interesting toxins in it, and these are all being drained back to the water. So it's a serious issue. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. I'm going to stop this slide short, but you can see the oil going into a storm drain here. That storm drain it's not a sewage drain, it's going to a treatment plant. That's going straight out to the estuary. So this is a problem. And so Margie and her students, she did this on a very shoestring budget with some students, but had some help with other people who looked at LIDAR, and then they used citizen science, people out there with cell phones during a storm to see where the water went. They mapped where it went. They used LIDAR to get the depth, and they figured out the volume. And then they also did measurements of how much nitrogen was in the water and figured that in this one event, 2,800 pounds of N from nitrate made it into the river. And the amazing thing is that single event was greater than the total nitrogen maximum daily load permitted for land-based allocation in a year. So in one of these blue sky events, they got a year's worth of nitrogen. Fortunately, this is at the mouth of the bay, but we have similar problems up in Annapolis. Not quite that bad, but almost. Not so much onto the grassy areas yet, but we're getting close. So this is a problem. Winds can exacerbate this kind of flooding. And that brings us back to the Goofs. And so I'm just going to leave you. I'm going to end here and just leave you with the only piece of advice I can give you, which is to please try to both locally, state, regionally, otherwise, let's worry a little bit and try to do the right thing. So with that, I think if we do this well, we can get rid of some of these folks, do this better,
Bill,
and we'll get back
you.
to
I think you've
questions.
summarized an amazing amount of information about this very large, complicated estuary. I'd like us to focus for just the remaining time on the one question you put early. Can we adapt our management in time? On a scale of 0 to 10, where 10 would be absolutely, positively yes, and 0 definitely not, where would you put your rating?
That is a really good question, and it's one that the Scientific Technical Advisory Committee is currently putting all their efforts into thinking hard about. And I'd say that the current feeling in terms of us meeting these adapt to climate, we're not even meeting. There's serious concern as to whether we're going to make that 2025 deadline and whether the bay is going to be sustainable even without climate change. And this extra lift is probably, so the quick answer to your question would be probably a 2 or a 3.
Yeah, I think that's about where I am too, because it's interesting. It's the largest, most complex system. This very large watershed. It's balkanized governance. That's one of the big problems when you've got 6 states in the District of Columbia, and nobody's really in charge with the authority to make people stick to their commitments. It's a little bit like the Paris Agreement.
Well, since 2010, EPA has had some authority, and they have pushed it pretty hard, but it's just a really difficult problem. And you put population growth on top of this, and people who are, it's just, some people, Pennsylvania stuff, just as you recognize, but they're coming around.
Will they come around in time, though? That's really the question. And we've spent something like north of $20 billion in restoration. And in the annual report cards that are given, and they've been given now for 13 or 14 years, the bay has never received a grade above a C, and that's on an inflated grade scale, where an A is a 70 and a C is 40. So I would like to think that my favorite estuary is going to turn it around. I think it's going to take a different model of governance and an additional approach in addition to the Chesapeake Bay program.
Yeah.
What's your thought?
I don't know what that program of governance would be. I think that what it takes is for everyone, I think, to recognize that the economic benefit of turning the bay around is way over $20 billion. It's in the trillions.
Oh, I think that's right. And the value of the bay is put at $1 trillion a year with all of the assets taken in, recreation, seafood, et cetera. But
I think it's remarkable that they've held it steady, though. They've at least held the pollution steady to date. Climate change is going to make a lot of things really tough.
It's going to make it much harder. I think, without that $20 billion, we wouldn't even be a C. We would have continued to decline. So I think it was a great service in doing that. But I don't think that the present approach is going to get us where either you or I want it to be.
No, I wish I had better answers. I tell you, there are a lot of people, a lot of good civil servants working really hard at it.
Yes. Oh no. I
think the Chesapeake Bay program is an agency of the EPA which is still managing to function really well despite the cutbacks they've had for 20 straight years, 25, 30. They have not been supported. I mean, it's national. It's not just the Bay.
No, that's right. But this takes on added importance because we haven't done a very good job in dealing with environmental problems at the regional level in any area of the United States. And the Chesapeake Bay program would be one that it would be nice to use as an example that you really can do it.
Yeah, and I think it's important to recognize too. I mean, the coronavirus outbreak right now is going to really hurt us financially, as we all know, because of the deficit. There's already a deficit, and so we don't have surplus to be spending on this, but we will be spending money on it, of course, and we should. And the reason I mention that is the recognition has to be there that in the long run, the money is well spent because having a functioning ecosystem helps prevent these kinds of things.
Yeah, that's true. We have to take the long view, and I think you're right with this present crisis. It's going to distract us, and the hit that it will take on the national economy and all the states in the Chesapeake Bay area are going to be difficult to overcome.
Yeah, it's going to be that much harder. And it's infrastructure is going to, we really need to improve our infrastructure, as you know, for water and wastewater as well. the treatment plants are there. We've been building treatment plants like crazy to solve this. And now the problem is all the pipes are rusting. So, and they're working on them. They're trying to get to them, but the money's not there. So it's a question of allocating resources.
And we not only will see a deterioration in water quality, but also in air quality. And I lived in Baltimore for 14 years. It has some of the worst air quality in the United States. The summers are hot, humid, and they're going to get worse. And we're going to have to deal with all of those issues.
But it has been better, Jerry, in the last 10 years. It has been better. And, a lot of these air pollution control laws before they were cut back a little bit, but they can be put back, and they really are making a difference, and they're going to help people's lives. It's really, I think we can do this. It's just a matter of political will. And so that's why when at my last slide, the only thing I can suggest is for us all to get behind this. We have resources. We spend it on a lot of things. We spend an awful lot on, on a lot of the military and other things. And some of that money is well spent if they participate in this process and recognize. And in terms of climate change, it's there. A lot of the benefit is actually coming from other resources.
No, there's no question about that. Well, Bill, unfortunately, we don't have anyone else here to ask questions. So I think with that, unless you would like to make a closing comment, we'll call it a night.
Okay, thank you very much. I really appreciate this opportunity. I'm sorry that I can't take questions. That's something I often look forward to a lot. And I know there are probably some out there. I don't know if I'll be able to answer all the questions by email, but you're certainly free to share my email with everyone. The email address is ballw@chesapeake.org. And if someone has a really burning question, I do my best to answer it.
All right. We'll pass that along. And Bill, thank you again very much. Good night.
Okay,
Good night, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And we hope you'll join us next week for the final class in this Aquatic Academy.
Bye, all.